it's all a bit scary because I feel like there's more and more and more content, but now what? Like people are drowning. It's also a bit of a misconception that you need motivation first in order to learn. I would call it a myth. The idea that adults are good at what we call self-directed learning is not correct.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Marketing for Learning podcast. I am so delighted to share this interview that I did with Mirjam Neelen recently. If any of you haven't heard of Mirjam Neelen, she is a very, very evidence-informed L&Der. She's constantly tackling myths and challenges in our industry and is now working heavily in a learning role at Novartis, and joined me to really talk a little bit more about what evidence-informed L&D really looks like. But as you can expect, we talk a lot about audience emotions. We talk about how we're actually, as an industry, still fixated on challenges such as learning styles and how we actually overcome or finally put them in the sea. This conversation was a really, really interesting insight because I, for one, have observed quite a lot of different learning science that I think mimics or echoes much of the psychology and logic that we see applied in marketing strategy. So I dig into some of that with Mirjam and try to more deeply understand how far this overlap truly goes between marketing and learning. It's a snackable 40 minutes, I have to say, but please do excuse the tiny glitches in Mirjam's audio. We were just having some connectivity issues throughout, so if there's some little pops and glitches, just bear with us. It's just the quality of the audio is what it is, and we can only make so much magic happen. Nevertheless, it's a really interesting conversation. I've just listened to it again, and I'm so proud to be able to present such an insightful data and evidence-led individual on this podcast. So whilst not directly related to marketing, we touch on quite a lot of themes that sit across both disciplines and explore really what data means for the future of learning and development. So strap on in, folks. It's set to be a good one. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Marketing for Learning podcast. I am joined today by a fantastic guest, a lady I have followed on LinkedIn for a very long time. She's incredibly wise and very well researched in the world of learning and development. Stop smirking at me. This is me being joined by Mirjam Neelen. Mirjam, hi. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and chat with me today.
Hey, Ashley, I'm very happy to be here. I am smirking if somebody calls me wise. Yes.
Hey, it takes a while to get that accolade, but I think you're there for sure. So for those, like I said, I think you're probably relatively well known in our industry, but for those who aren't familiar with who you are, would you mind maybe just spending a minute or two giving us a bit of info on your background, what you're up to at the moment?
I'm Mirjam. I have been in L&D for about 15 years or so. Started as an instructional designer, e-learning developer, and then slowly moved into more like strategic roles. So currently I'm head of learning design and learning sciences. I really love my title at Novartis. And so I want to make a disclaimer at this point to say I'm here today as Mirjam, so not representing Novartis. I'm just talking here as myself. So currently in my current role, I am responsible for building capabilities for learning professionals. So basically, my job is to help learning professionals at Novartis to build their capability in the learning experience design space.
Oh, brilliant. So you're training, not train the trainers,
Train
but
the
you're
trainer. Well,
yeah.
kind of, yeah. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out what the best way is, but yeah, kind of meta. It's a bit meta that
That's
way.
cool though, because I think, at least in my experience, the kind of cobbler's son's shoes and all that. I don't see us always, or L&D practitioners, always having the time to feel like they can actually develop themselves and evolve their thinking, embrace new research, new sciences, things like that. So for you to have that role in an organization is amazing.
It is actually quite rare, I think, that a role like that exists. And the way I've been doing it so far, without going into details, but to kind of have a combination of working with the business so that I understand, what the reality looks like, and then trying to build case studies, tools, methodologies that then others can use, but also learn from others. So it's a big community thing as well, where we work together to figure out what good looks like. Although I must say, like, my vision on evidence-informed learning design is quite strong. So that's, one of the reasons that I was hired. So that's really what I'm trying to drill into the organization, which is not an easy task.
No, I mean, it's a big ship, isn't it? Steering it in a different direction, I expect, is very, very hard. So I think, but like you said, actually even being evidence-led, again, not always a trait that I see a lot. Like we had Peter Manish-Reber on the podcast recently, and he's got Derek Mitchell there, who's just purely around analytics at Novo Nordisk.
Yeah.
And they again are just very data led. So are data informed, I suppose, is probably a better stance on it rather than data led. But I am starting to see more emergence of an emphasis on data, especially business data, impact data, things where we can really start to prove our value as a learning function. Are you kind of seeing a similar thing across the market? Or
Yeah, we actually, we were just going through a reorg. So my colleague, who was originally on my team, has now moved to another team. But we also have a specific role, like a learning impact, learning insights role, which is specifically focused on how do we think about impacts and how do we start to think about it from the very start. And also, yeah, how do we collect and aggregate data that we can then use to make better informed decisions overall.
Yeah.
So that's great.
Yeah, and I think, for me, that getting it right from the start is quite an interesting angle, isn't it? Especially as we come towards the end of another financial year. I know a lot of our clients and a lot of professionals are in the kind of planning stage of, what to actually do for the next year. How do we actually deliver more impact? How do we truly get a positive sentiment towards learning in our organization? Do you, obviously, I don't, without kind of going into strategies that you're actually executing in your organization and whatnot, what's your opinion, or what's your kind of hot take on what might be coming from a trending learning perspective? Is there anything that is, barring AI, which everyone was talking about? I'm yet to see it being applied, but
Well, so I usually don't, I'm not very big on hot takes or trends. And the reason is that I feel that we still haven't built the foundation of our practice very well. So I am still personally focused on that foundation. So that to me is, what's the need? Does the need to be solved by learning? If so, what type of need is it? Is it knowledge? Is it skills? If it's skills, is it simple skills? Is it complex skills? What does that mean for your design approach? Thinking about that impact strategy from the very start, doing user research to understand people's reality, thinking about the learner engagement, from the very start, and how you want to tackle that and what you're trying to achieve and what success looks like and all that stuff. So to me, I mean, the trends, I don't know. I just am personally not that interested in trends because they come and go. And I actually feel that the focus on trends have distracted us a little bit from building that foundation. Things like, from what I remember since I've been, like, a trend has been mobile learning. Okay, well, that has kind of like kicked in because people use these devices all the time. So, okay, yeah, that has had consequences for how you need to design. AI is probably going to be big. I'm not an expert on it, but that will evolve quite quickly, I think, and we should definitely figure out like what that means for our practice. But anyway, long story short, I do see a bit of a shift though, where people start to talk more holistically about learning, which I'm really happy with. I see more conversations around, the performance consulting, wearing that hat. Um, Evidence informed in general, I think, is getting a bit hip and trendy, which is nice in one way and a bit tricky in another way, because there's also a lot of evidence that's not really evidence, but just presented as evidence. So there's always a bit of that, I think. But also a shift to I see more people talk about task focus, like the context of the work and really thinking about what things mean in the context of the work. So I think there are good things, but when you talk about budgeting and planning, to me, what I would hope is that organizations would really think about where should we invest. And that sounds really simple, but it's not, because I
Mm.
think we've moved to kind of like a way of thinking where we talk a lot about content and libraries and how we should user generated content. So this, to me, it's all a bit scary because I feel like there's more and more and more content, but now what? Like people are drowning, and it's, yeah, I am actually quite worried about that trend. But
Yeah, and I mean it's definitely a theme that we see with our customers a lot, where they'll have a lot of systems with a lot of content libraries, and the truth of the matter is learners and employees just don't know where to go, what to do when they get there. They're absolutely inundated, and obviously from a user journey perspective, how are we ever going to build habits when the first or second experience they have is just complete overwhelm? So I'm absolutely with you. I think we need to take a step back and actually be led more by what's required from the business, rather than being order takers, kind of breaking down some of those barriers for sure, in terms of just because someone says they need an e-learning module on X, Y, or Z doesn't mean that they need an e-learning module. And I think it's up to us to have more professional curiosity about why people are asking for that stuff. Is it just because they think that's the only way people learn, or is that the only way we can deliver learning in a corporate infrastructure? So I think that why is where we've got to start. Absolutely. I think that the biggest challenge for most of us is unpicking that gargantuan machine that we've made. How do you go back to baseline when you've invested significantly in tech and platforms and content and the delivery methods that sit behind that? Starting from scratch is nigh on impossible, would you say?
I would say so, yes. And I think that that's not going to happen because you're right. Like organizations have invested a lot of money in, things like LXPs and all kinds of other systems. I think the infrastructure is usually there, and I think there's in general nothing wrong with the infrastructure. I do think that organizations need to use more data to figure out to what extent these platforms or tools or other types of technologies are actually used and what they're used for. I think often they're bought without having a clear strategy up front, like what we're trying to achieve with them. Which, okay, if that has happened, that's fine. You can still think about that, after you've invested in it. But I think to create more clarity around that, like what are we trying to achieve? When are we using what? Thinking about that, what you're saying, like that, the user experience, like if we have all these different platforms, then how are we going to make it one nice user experience for the user? But also when I think about content libraries, and I see that in Novartis as well, is that what I think is really difficult is to create a context around the content. So you see a lot of content, but then to create a narrative around that and to help people understand how one piece of content is connected to the other, I think there's a big misconception, or even it's I would call it a myth. The idea that adults are good at what we call self-directed learning is not correct. We're not, except when we're experts and we really know what we're looking for and we really know what we don't know. But in general, we're not good at it. And it's even worse in this case because what we do is we drown people in a sea of content. And then if they don't learn what they need, we'll say, well, it's up to you. We're offering you a self-directed learning experience.
Yeah.
Well, no, we're overwhelming people and we're expecting them to navigate. Yeah,
Then where's the
it's not
motivation?
fair. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, for me, with my marketer's hat on, I look at that as where's the motivation to engage with the product? It's missing a piece for me around the why. And certainly through, countless discovery sessions that we've had with clients, I've never failed to be staggered by the amount of learning content that doesn't seem to relate to the task at hand or the role that they do, or even their career aspirations. There just is a lot of stuff. And with the best will in the world, there's a lot of stuff on the internet. I don't go around Googling, how to start painting or something like that. I'm not gonna be overrun by that desire to go and learn something new necessarily. But if I have a specific need or a desire to learn to paint, or, so suddenly I'm shoved into an art class for some reason, then my reason for needing to go and explore that will change. That's exactly the same with our employees. At the moment, they either don't know where to go, so they'll default to the internet, and they'll solve their issues that way. But as long as our learning isn't really kind of positioned in a place where it's solving problems and actually servicing the individual, I think that, we're going to continue to run into challenges.
But that's exactly it, right? Because I think that whole idea of the point of need and then go to explore, that will only work. I mean, yes, but that to me is more a search thing, like, and to make sure that people can search and that your search works well and that people can find information at the point of need. That is to me something different than when you have to learn something. So you can find. I actually was repairing my flat tire over the weekend, my bike, which I mean, my dad taught me that. But anyway, I have a need. So I might go on YouTube and see how to do it, and I might be able to do it. It still doesn't mean I've learned it necessarily in one go, right? I might need to repeat it. So,
Yep.
so there's a difference between, I don't think we make that distinction clear enough between, okay, people need to find the right information at the point of need to be able to do something well at that point in time. That doesn't mean they've learned it. That's fine, as long as they are able to complete the tasks successfully at that point in time. But then if you want to design to learn, then a completely different process kicks in, because then it goes back to what you were saying. What's the context of when people need to learn this? What does it take to learn this? Like, do they need to remember facts, or do they just need to practice, or whatever? You need to ask all that type of questions. And then the content is only going to get you so far. I recently designed like a learning design foundations journey, and I did it with mostly curated content, but still a lot of work, because you have to make sure that people understand like how this one bit of a piece of content that already existed. So it's not exactly the same language as the previous, so you have to help people to connect the dots and to create that narrative and to explain and it's still design.
So obviously you've mentioned evidence-informed learning design a few times. Can you explain a little bit more to me what that is and how that kind of deviates from maybe the more traditional instructional design approaches that have existed?
Ooh, I don't know let me start by explaining what it is. So it has like three types of evidence that you use to inform design decisions. So it would be your experience and expertise. It would be systems data and stakeholders. So evidence from systems and stakeholders. And the third pillar would be evidence from the learning sciences. So there's three different types of evidence that you would use to make decisions as you go. It's a different from like evidence-based, in the sense that evidence-based is really like like how you say that, grounded in the medical world. So it's really about using really high quality evidence to make decisions for individual patients. So in our world, that's a bit different, because you always have to be quite careful how you interpret evidence, especially from the sciences, because it's a bit softer. I mean, it's better than nothing, so you still need to use it. But you always have to kind of like test and evaluate in your specific context. You ask how it's different from like traditional instructional design. I think traditional instructional design also gathers evidence, for example, by working with subject matter experts and gather evidence around, what does the learning, what needs to be learned, what does that look like. I don't know to what extent it actually triggers people to use the evidence that we have from the learning sciences. So, I mean, instructional design is more like the process, right? And you use the evidence within the process to make decisions. So, yeah, it's not necessarily something different. It's more at a different level.
Yeah. So it's actually, to me, it sounds like a more iterative process, one where you're actually kind of constantly feeding in information that you get from some of your initiatives and pulling them back in to help you improve and evolve.
Yeah, I think you can, I mean, I usually think about it as I use the knowledge that I have on, what's known through the learning sciences. I know that to make better informed decisions initially. So I know, for example, that if people need to remember something, well, then you need to design spaced learning because people just remember better if you space things out over time. So there's just certain things that we know about how people learn that you should use to make your design decisions. So that's, to me, is one way of looking at it. But then the iterative approach kicks in a little bit later, where you have designed something and then you test and evaluate and make sure that it works the way you intended it to work, or you ask your users to, test it for you and think out loud, for example, like, do they interpret things the way you intended it, the activity to be, or whatever. So I think that way, so that's the user evidence then, or the evidence from the testing. So yeah, there's just all kinds of different evidence that you need to use.
Yeah. I love that, though, actually being more data led and actually allowing us to have wider insight into it, rather than just developing something and kind of, again, just throwing it into the LMS and going, yeah, here you go, I made you that lovely thing. Yeah, exactly. Oh, I tell you what, people loved it. I think actually being more discerning about our own output, our own work, and having a desire to improve and evolve what we do, good marketers do the same thing, right? Like we do campaigns that flop or fail, and we feed that information back into our initiatives, our approaches, to help us do better and better understand our audiences. Everything's one big giant experiment, really.
Yeah, I always say, like, I distinguish between evaluation for success and evaluation for improvement. So I think those are two completely different things. Like, it's a completely different way of thinking what you need to measure, right?
What in your mind does, because obviously you mentioned light learning impact a few times earlier on in our conversation, like, what to you is success for a learning function? And I know that's a very ethereal question. It's kind of a bit fluffy, but
For a learning function. So I was going to say, my colleague told me this phrase that I actually have here on my desk. Impact is defined by the problem, which I really like as a, yeah, because so it depends, right? And also I wrote down, because I couldn't remember it, but I kind of want to read out loud. So what he uses in his framework is, shout out to Duchamp here. Impact is defined as the difference in the indicator of performance with the interventions and without the interventions. So what difference does it make, right? So I really like that way of thinking. So for a learning function, it depends.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it does, though, right? I mean, it's a kind of an intentionally difficult question, because I think that's the point, isn't it? Because there's got to be a balance between what the business wants from us, but also what the learner needs, and finding some marriage between the two, right? Like, how do we achieve business objectives through learning initiatives, i.e. engaging audiences and developing, a range of sophisticated learning solutions, whatever. But we still got to meet that. To me, it's driven by the business need, right? But I don't, again, and maybe your experience is different. A lot of organizations that we work with and people I've had conversations with, they're not typically learning-led organizations. So the learning function in general isn't necessarily under a huge amount of scrutiny, certainly more so now as we enter a very questionable economic time. But for the most part, it's not necessarily been a function that is looked at to deliver impact in the way that maybe sales or marketing is, for example. Yet they carry substantial budgets. I've always found it a really fascinating dynamic.
I also think there's a difference, right? So that's why I was fascinated by your addition as a learning function, because I think there is the impact from the requester side, and I think it's our job to ask them these questions, right? So when they come to us and they say they have a need, so let's say this is the ideal client, and they say we have a need, we don't really know what the solution looks like, that's why we come to you, right? Woohoo, that's a really, really great situation to be in. But I think it's up to us then to ask, like, okay, what are you trying to achieve? How do you know it's been successful, right? So that's one. So from a learning function perspective, I would say that's one part of it. One part is that you have these conversations with the business and that you make sure that you find ways to measure impact for them. But I also think as a learning function, there are other impact metrics to consider, such as If you think about let's say your part of your strategy is that you really want um, to put your experts on in the spotlight, and so you're really big on user generated content, and so then, for example, some kind of knowledge sharing index could be uh, an impact metric to say, yeah, since we're doing this, like we're just sharing way more, information flows like way more transparently. It's way easier for people to find the expertise that they need at the point in time or whatever. I mean, it really depends. And I think that whole learning culture and that way of thinking is also part of being a good learning function. It's not just about um, what the business is asking for. Right?
Yeah, and I think, especially as well, like learning can play a big role in the EVP, for example, and I think we almost need to envision ourselves as a bigger piece of the pie than maybe we're allocated at times. I think, we need to get a bit too big for our boots and, be a little bit more confident, and actually we can add a lot of value. Like, at its core, I know it does sound corny, but really learning and development can positively impact people's lives. Not a lot of it. I know but it is true. If when done well, you can help people progress their careers. You can help them become more confident, more capable, more able. And I think we get a bit lost in the kind of hairiness of it sometimes. But at its core, most learning professionals I work with that I know, they're hugely passionate about people. They're hugely passionate about helping people develop. And I think sometimes we just get a bit entrenched in what the business is asking for. The tech is such a simple, quick kill solution that we go for that instead of actually, again, what does the learner actually need? What do they want, and how can we best support that? Because, going back to your point about your bike tire, you don't ever need to remember how to fix your bike tire because you can always go to YouTube. And so, there's an element of relinquishing control of also measuring every, what does learning mean? Has learning happened? The impossible question to answer. Sometimes we don't need to know that learning's happened to know that we're enabling people to get stuff done. But I think there is that bigger piece more around helping them develop new skills. And I think that's where your kind of evidence informed stuff plays a much more dynamic role. You mentioned spaced repetition earlier, and I'm not hugely familiar with the in-depth detail of the science behind how spaced repetition helps people learn. But I know that marketing campaigns really work because we consistently present an idea, a brand, a product, whatever it might be, consistently to people over a period of time, in order to enable us to create more memory recall around the brand, product, whatever. Is that learning science? Am I just kind of basically applying that to marketing, or is it the psychology behind it? Because to me, it's the same thing. It's basically repeating the same idea in different ways over a period of time.
Yeah, I must say, I think with marketing, there's probably other elements to it that I know nothing about. More also tapping into certain emotions, maybe, or desires or whatever. But yeah, from a learning perspective, it is literally strengthening, the memory trace in your brain. And ideally, if you have spaced practice where people also have to do something, then it's not only strengthening, because if you trigger them to actively retrieve something from long-term memory, then you're not only strengthening the memory trace, but also making it more flexible, because the activities are usually, slightly different, or it happens in a slightly different context. So it makes the traces stronger, and it makes people more flexible. So the flexibility you probably don't need for marketing. So my answer to your question is I don't know, but I guess the habitual, like that, the strengthening the memory trace could potentially be part of that.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that fascinates me the most about marketing is like the psychology of humans, human behavior, why we do what we do, and how you can influence that in such subtle ways. But I've always found the spaced repetition, I mean, to me, that is literally just a marketing campaign, because we don't send out the same image over and over again or the same blog post. We variate, we change things, we get people to do different stuff, send them to different places and spaces. It's basically the same logic, just applied in a different manner. So anyways, I knew that you'd know more about it, and I've always kind of like sat and pondered on it and gone, is that a thing? Is that
I think
something?
I think like the marketing is more in the behavioral science angle, right? And of course, behavioral science plays into the learning sciences as well. But I just think that for marketing, there's more to it than just the strengthening of the memory trace. I think there's probably something in, triggering people's, I don't know, wants and needs, or even the perception that they need something that they actually don't necessarily need, or maybe they do.
But do you not think that we would need to do that to convince someone to do anything, even if it is to undertake learning?
I think it depends, not necessarily. I think for certain learning needs, it is important to tap into emotions, and but it's subtle, it's nuanced as well, because if you're triggering emotions too strongly, people might not learn. So it can also inhibit learning if you go in a direction that, in an emotional direction where you don't need. And also, you don't necessarily, it's also a bit of a misconception that you need motivation first in order to learn. Learning, like, you can also activate motivation through learning. So if you design something that people might initially, okay, they might maybe understand what's in it for them, but it might not necessarily be super motivated yet. But if it's something that's well designed, and as they go, they are getting more on board because they start to see how it is relevant in their context, and they start maybe to see the consequences of when they don't do it. And then if they start to achieve success, that can trigger motivation. So it's not, it works in two directions. I don't think you always have to consider that behavioral element. Sometimes you do. I think it kind of depends what it is.
Yeah, like what you're kind of trying to achieve, or I guess again we'll go back to the why, right? Simon Sinek's golden circle. We're back at the why. So, the reason we kind of started having a conversation on LinkedIn, and when I asked you to come on this podcast, was something that crops up time and time again in our world of learning. And it's this learning myths and some of the myths that are perpetuated in our industry over and over and over again. I know you have quite strong opinions on some of them, particularly like the Myers-Briggs and personality test ones, and learning styles, everybody's favorite. Why do you? I mean, well, we can absolutely talk about why these are not valid theories for a start, if you'd like to. But I'd also like to ask you, why do you think these continue to be perpetuated in our industry despite being widely debunked?
I think because people like simple concepts, something that's easy to understand, and yeah, something to get your head around. But also because it makes sense to people. It's how they experience learning themselves. So I think it has a lot to do with, especially with learning styles. The whole, it resonates with people that the idea that we're all like different, and we're all individuals, and that's also almost like a cultural thing in the West, I would say. Like, it's very focused on individuals, and it's very hard to accept for people that cognitively, like, our cognitive architecture is pretty much the same for everyone. Apart from some exceptions, of course, where people, like with neurodiversity, there are some exceptions for sure. But in general, it's just people don't like that idea because it gives them the sense that we're all the same. But that's not the same thing. Having, we all have, like, well, not all, but most people have two arms and two legs. That doesn't mean we're the same, but it still means we have two arms and two legs. They're the same. They're not exactly the same, but like, it's, people don't like that idea. I think that we all learn in the same way. It's just something they don't like.
There's an infatuation with the kind of individualistic nature of our world these days anyways, isn't there? And I think, like, especially Myers-Briggs, everyone loves to do a quiz about, oh, who am I? How do I think? Oh, I'm so interested in, oh, I didn't know this about myself. Hey, look at my star sign. Tell me something I don't know. Like, I think this like desire to more deeply understand ourselves on a subconscious level, to me, that's where like the Myers-Briggs stuff comes from. The learning styles, again, for me, is it just, it's an easy way to bucket content delivery, and so it's kind of got conflated with like learning preferences. Because I'll give you an example, not the same exactly from a learning perspective, but when I'm researching something online on Google, I'll almost always go open images first. So if I'm like brainstorming something or I'm trying to be more creative, I will always go look for visual stuff over text and stuff first. But I'm way more comfortable writing things down and actually, getting stuff pen to paper. So, that to me, that's not a learning style. It's just how I prefer to access information in specific contexts.
Yeah, and then you have to ask, everybody has preferences, right? But then you have to ask yourself, like, how effective is my behavior? I mean, you don't really know because there's no way to test it. I mean, there would be, but I mean, we haven't done that. At least I haven't looked into it. So, but that's the whole idea with learning styles is the same, right? So people might have certain preferences. That doesn't mean we should follow the preferences. Like if I have a preference for sweets, that doesn't mean that I should follow that preference. So it's not always the case that your preferences are to be followed, And in this case, the research clearly shows that following a preference and designing for a preference is not effective. In fact, it's ineffective. So it depends on what you need to learn, where you are in the learning process, what the most effective design is. But yeah, I think that's it. People experience this preference, and they experience that as that that works for them. So it's just really hard for people to accept that might not necessarily be the best way of doing it.
And it's kind of like you said, it's hard to disprove. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, isn't it? Like I've got no reason to think that the way that I'm doing something is ineffective. But if I try different, if you actually experimented, you would get an answer. But ultimately, we're creatures of habit, aren't we? And so we fall into our ways of managing information and dealing with the world as it comes to us, don't we? So
I can make a confession here. I mean, I know that spaced learning is better. I know that highlighting is not very effective, but I love to highlight sometimes. And when I read a book, I underline loads of things, and then I make a lot of notes in the side, and I never look at it again, and I don't remember any of it. But it gives me a sense of like doing something useful and that I'm learning something. But it's because the other stuff, the spaced learning and making notes and then processing them, that's way more effortful. Like I rather have a sense of, ooh, look at how productive I am. I'm taking the next book and then I underline again. Then I've read 5 books.
I think I've read like 1 book since my son's been born. Unfortunately, I've started about 5, but it's like we were saying as well. Like there's an element of like human satisfaction in that. We both have to-do lists with big items on them at the moment, so we're getting no satisfaction because nothing's getting scrubbed off the list.
Short-term versus long-term. What's the word? Satisfaction.
Yeah, exactly. So I know I'm conscious that we're quite short on time here, and I know you need to jump off in a few minutes. I think the one other thing I just really wanted to ask you is, I know that you like I said, you do a lot of research yourself. You're very research led as a L&D practitioner. What's the one thing from like a learning sciences perspective that you would want someone listening today to take away? Is there anything that kind of you see repeatedly time and time again that's done in error, or that you kind of see people constantly making the same mistakes or the same choices that don't necessarily lean into the way people learn?
Yeah, I think I'm just going to keep it really simple, given the fact, just going back to the content piece. Just think about, like, go back to the science and think about how people learn and how we process information. I think that is very basic, but really, really important. And just go back to things like Meyer's multimedia principles, like look at how many, like how your content is displayed, like on a screen, for example. Do you use signaling? Stop doing like the redundant like voiceover with the text. It's all quite simple, but I think it can be quite impactful if you follow the science and just don't do something because it looks so pretty.
Yeah.
And use like lovely colored themes that have nothing to do with the content and so are just distracting for people and causing cognitive overload. So yeah, think about the limitations of our working memory and what that means for designing information even.
Yeah. I've loved this conversation. We've been so learner focused, and everything we've discussed really, if you really think about it, we've talked very much about people as people, putting the learner at the center of why we're developing things, and really answering those kind of core fundamental questions about how we can best serve our employees as a learning function. So thank you so much for getting my brain going and getting me thinking and sharing your insights with our audience here on the Marketing for Learning podcast. Mirjam, it's been my absolute pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you so much.
Same here, and thank you so much for the invitation, and thanks for the chat.
Thank you. All right, well, enjoy the rest of your evening, and I will see you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye.